It is printed on a coffee mug in a kitchen somewhere this morning. It is painted on the wall of a gym, right above the heaviest rack. It is tattooed on a forearm. It is whispered by a student before an exam, shouted by an athlete after a winning play, pinned to a vision board next to a number that says how much money someone wants to make this year. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You have heard it 1,000 times. You may have said it yourself this week. And almost every single time it gets used, it is being used to say something the man who wrote it never meant. Now here is what makes this strange. The real meaning is not smaller than the popular one. It is bigger. It is heavier. It just points in a direction almost nobody expects. And to find it, you have to do the one thing most people never do with this verse. You have to read the sentences sitting right next to it. When you do, you find something hidden in plain sight. The man who wrote these words says he learned a secret, not a metaphor, not a figure of speech. He uses a word that came straight out of the ancient mystery religions, a word for being initiated into something you were never allowed to see before. A secret that stayed locked until suffering handed him the key. So hold on to that. What was the secret? And why does it flip this entire verse upside down? To answer that, you have to go to the place where the verse was actually born. Because where it was born changes everything. This is not a story about a coffee mug. This is not a story about success. This is not a story about getting what you want. This is a story about a man in chains who found something the free world has been chasing for 2,000 years and still cannot buy. Let me show you. Start with the popular reading because you already know it. It goes like this. God will help you accomplish whatever you set your mind to. Pray hard enough. Believe sincerely enough, and the promotion comes, the healing comes, the victory comes. The verse becomes a kind of spiritual engine, a divine turbo boost bolted onto human ambition. And honestly, that reading feels powerful. For a while, but it has a fatal flaw. It only works when life is going your way. The moment things break, it collapses. When the promotion does not come, when the test results come back wrong, when the marriage does not recover, when the child does not come home, when the business folds and the body fails, this version of the verse has nothing left to say. Worse than nothing, because if the verse promised you success, then your suffering must mean something went wrong. Maybe God did not show up. Maybe your faith was too weak. And the person sitting in the wreckage gets handed a second wound on top of the first one. But that is not what Paul is talking about. Not even close. And the first clue is the address on the envelope. He is writing from a Roman prison. Forget the clean, modern picture of a jail cell. A first-century Roman detention could mean a chain bolting your wrist to a guard, cold stone, bad food or not enough of it, and a legal future you cannot see, where the verdict at the end might be release or might be a sword. Paul is not writing this from a quiet study with a cup of tea. He is writing it from confinement, and he is writing it to people he loves. The church he is writing to lived in a city called Philippi. He helped plant it himself, one of the very first churches in Europe. The book of Acts tells you how it started, and it is not a tidy story. Paul crosses into Macedonia after a vision in the night. He meets a businesswoman named Lydia by a river, and she becomes the first convert on the continent. He casts a spirit out of a slave girl, and her owners, furious they have lost their income, drag him into the marketplace. Paul and his friend Silas are stripped, beaten with rods, and thrown into the inner cell. And then at midnight, those two bleeding men start to sing. An earthquake hits. The chains fall off. The jailer, certain his prisoners have escaped, draws his sword to kill himself, and Paul stops him. By morning, the jailer and his whole household are baptized. A church born in an earthquake, in a prison in chains. So now picture it. A man in chains is writing to a church that was born in chains. That alone should make you lean in. But that is not the surprising part. The surprising part is what he says he feels in that cell. Not despair, not grim gritted teeth survival. Joy. That word joy shows up 16 times in this one short letter. A man who might be executed within the year is writing the most joy-soaked letter in the entire New Testament. And the obvious question, the one the whole letter is built to answer, is simply this. How? How is that even possible? Here is what most people miss. The answer is hiding in the two verses right before the famous one. Read them slowly. Paul writes, "Not that I speak from need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need." Stop there. Read it again in your head. Do you hear what he is actually describing? He is not describing ambition. He is describing range. He has lived in seasons of plenty and seasons of real physical hunger. He has had more than enough and he has had nothing. And in both, he says he has learned the one thing almost nobody ever learns: how to be content. That is the word the popular version erases completely. Content, not victorious, not dominant, not unstoppable. Content. And here is why that should land on you personally. You probably will not spend tonight in a prison cell, but you know the other thing. You know the prayer that went unanswered, the career that stalled out, the diagnosis that did not improve, the loneliness that never quite lifts. The principle is exactly the same. Paul is describing a kind of inner steadiness that does not rise and fall with your circumstances. And then only then comes verse 13, not as a brag about limitless human potential, as the floor underneath a man who has learned to be steady in the dark. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The all things are not career goals or trophies or sales targets. The all things are the very conditions he just listed. Being brought low, going hungry, living with need, losing comfort, sitting in a cell with no promise of ever walking out. Paul is saying, I can endure every one of these because Christ holds me up inside them. That is a radically different sentence than the one on the mug. If this is hitting you differently than it ever has, do me a favor. Take 1 second and subscribe, because this channel exists to put the Bible back in its real context, the way it was actually written. And tell me in the comments right now, where did you first see Philippians 4:13? On a wall, a mug, a tattoo. I read these and I think the answers are going to surprise you. Now stay with me because we are still not at the secret. And Paul just used a word he had no business using. The Greek word he picks for content is autarchs. And that word did not come from the synagogue. It came from the philosophers. It was a technical term in Stoic philosophy, and it described a person who had reached complete inner self-sufficiency, someone whose calm depended on nothing outside himself. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius would have nodded at that word. The teacher Epictetus built nearly his whole philosophy around it. Need nothing, want nothing, become a fortress no event can touch. But Paul is not a Stoic. And when he picks up their prized word, he guts it and fills it with something they never had. For the Stoic, the sufficiency came from the self. You were the source. You hardened yourself until the world could not reach you. For Paul, the sufficiency comes from Christ. The shape of the word looks the same. The source is the exact opposite. The Stoic says, I need nothing. Paul says, I have someone. And it gets more precise. The phrase behind I can do all things is panta iskuo. Iskuo means to be strong enough to have the strength for something. Panta means all things, but the all things are not floating out in space as some unlimited claim about what a human can pull off. They are nailed down by everything Paul just said. This is not an abstract promise about your capability. It is a personal report about God's supply in hard places. And the phrase, through Christ who strengthens me, uses the word endynamouti. It means to pour strength into, to empower from within. Look at the front of that word, the little prefix n. It means n. Christ does not strengthen Paul from across the room. The power runs inside the weakness. That sounds like a tiny grammar detail. It is not. It is the whole thing. Because Paul wrote about this exact pattern somewhere else. In his second letter to the Corinthians, he talks about a thorn in his flesh. We do not know exactly what it was, some persistent, grinding suffering. And 3 times he begged God to take it away. 3 times. And God's answer was not removal. God's answer was, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul's response should stop you cold. He says he will boast about his weaknesses gladly so that the power of Christ can rest on him. For when I am weak, he writes, then I am strong. And here is where it gets remarkable. This was not a one-time thought. This strength through weakness pattern is not a single verse Paul stumbled into. It runs through his whole life, and not just his. It runs through the entire Bible like a thread you cannot unsee once you have seen it. Think about Joseph. thrown into a pit by his own brothers, sold to slave traders, falsely accused and locked in an Egyptian prison for years. God's power did not show up to stop the suffering. It showed up inside it. And at the end, standing in front of the brothers who sold him, Joseph says the line that holds the whole thread together. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." The strength did not cancel the pit. It met him in the pit. Think about David, anointed as the next king while he was still a teenager, and then hunted like an animal through the wilderness for years, hiding in caves from a king who wanted him dead. And those caves are where he wrote the Psalms that the whole world still praise. The strength did not lift him out of the wilderness. The strength found him there in the dark and gave him songs. Think about Jeremiah, a prophet lowered by ropes into a cistern, a deep pit with mud at the bottom, sinking, abandoned by the very people he was trying to warn. God did not pull him out the second it got hard. The suffering was allowed to do its slow work first. And then think about Jesus. In the Garden of Gethsemane, on the worst night in human history, sweating drops like blood, asking the Father if there is any way the cup could pass from him. And the Father's answer was not to remove the cup. The answer was presence. Strength to walk into the suffering, not a door marked exit. The strength did not erase the cross. The strength carried him through it. And then Paul in a Roman cell writing about joy. Do you see it? Every single time the same shape. God's strength shows up inside the weakness, not instead of it. That is not a coincidence you can wave away. That is the architecture of how God works in the whole story. And Philippians 4:13 is one window cut into that architecture, letting you see the whole pattern through one small frame. This is the moment the verse stops being a poster and becomes something enormous. It is not a promise that your circumstances will turn around. It is a promise that Christ is enough when they do not. But we still have not opened the secret. Paul said he learned it. And the exact word he chose for learned is the key that unlocks the whole thing. In verse 12 he says, "I have learned the secret." The Greek word underneath is memiemi from the root muo. And this is initiation language. In the ancient world, this word belonged to the mystery religions. It meant to be led blindfolded through a process, into a hidden knowledge you could not reach any other way. You did not read your way in. You did not think your way in. You were initiated. Paul takes that loaded word and repurposes it. He is telling you that contentment in all circumstances is not natural. It is not automatic. He was not born with it, and neither were you. It is something he was initiated into. He was trained into it slowly, through experience, through suffering, through one encounter after another with the sufficiency of Christ in the exact places where his own strength ran dry. And that changes how you hear verse 13 one final time. This is not a casual slogan from a man having a good day. This is testimony from the far side of a long and painful education. He learned to be content by being placed in situations where contentment was impossible without Christ. He learned strength by being put in rooms where human strength was simply not enough. So here at last is the secret. The secret is not a technique. The secret is not a mindset hack you can practice until you master it. The secret is a person. It is Christ present and real in the exact place where your self-reliance dies. And do not imagine Paul figured this out quickly or cleanly. Look at the actual resume of his life. Shipwrecked, stoned and left for dead, beaten with rods, hungry, cold, betrayed by friends, hounded by people who wanted him discredited or killed, imprisoned again and again, and in the end, according to the early church historians, executed under Rome. Sit with that for a second. If Philippians 4:13 means God will help you succeed at whatever you attempt, then Paul's life is the loudest counterexample in the entire Bible. By every external scoreboard, his life looked like failure stacked on failure. It looked like repeated suffering, held together by a joy that had no earthly right to be there. And that joy is the real miracle of this verse. Most people hear the word endurance and feel it as a downgrade. Achievement sounds thrilling. Endurance sounds like gritting your teeth and hanging on. But that is not what Paul is describing. He is describing a man who is freer in chains than most people are in comfortable houses. And the reason is not his willpower. The reason is Christ inside him, pouring strength into the weakness from within. Now I want to take you into the one room where all of this stops being theology and becomes the most personal thing you will ever read. You know the room. You have been in it or you will be. It is the room where you already prayed and the answer was no. The room where the test came back and the news was bad. The room where the door you pounded on stayed shut. The room where the relationship did not heal, where the phone did not ring, where you lay on your back at 3 in the morning staring at a ceiling you could not see. The motivational version of this verse has absolutely nothing to say in that room. It cannot even come inside, because it promised you that room would not exist. It promised that enough faith would keep you out of it. But the real verse, the actual verse, was written for that exact room. It was written by a man sitting in that exact room in a cell in chains, and he is leaning across 2,000 years to tell you something. Christ meets you here. The strength is not given to you so you can escape the room. The strength is given so you can stay faithful inside it. The joy is possible not because your circumstances finally cooperated, but because the one holding you up is greater than everything pressing in. That is the secret he was initiated into. That is the testimony buried underneath the most misquoted verse in the Bible. There is one last thing you cannot miss. Paul does not say, I can do all things through my faith, or through my effort, or through my devotion. He says, through Christ who strengthens me. The strength is not his. He is the vessel. Christ is the source, which means even the corrected version of this verse can be twisted. You can hear that it is about endurance, not achievement, and then quietly turn endurance into a brand new performance test. Now I must endure flawlessly. I must never waver. I must show perfect contentment or I have failed. But Paul never claims he never wavered. He says he learned. And learning means a process. A process means there were days the contentment had not arrived yet. He is not presenting himself as unbreakable. He is presenting Christ as inexhaustible. One of those puts the weight back on your shoulders. The other puts it on the shoulders of Jesus. And only one of them is good news. So takeaway number 1. Philippians 4:13 is not a blank check for your ambition. It is a man in chains telling you that Christ is sufficient when everything else is not. The all things are not your goals. They are your hardest circumstances, and the promise is that you can endure them because the strength comes from inside the weakness, not instead of it. Takeaway number 2, and this one is for you specifically. The next time you are in the room, the one with the closed door and the unanswered prayer, you do not have to perform your way out. You do not have to manufacture a victory to prove your faith works. You are allowed to be brought low and still be held. That is not weak faith. That is the exact place this verse was written to reach. And takeaway number 3. The verse does not need to be rescued from weakness. It was born there. It was written by a man with chains on his wrists who had already counted every achievement in his life as loss, and who had already decided that to live is Christ and to die is gain. When a man like that says, I can do all things, he is not talking about conquering the world. He is telling you he found something better than the world, something prison-proof and hunger-proof and death-proof, and that it is available to you right now in your worst moment, not your best one. The verse on the coffee mug was never about conquering anything. It was written by a man carrying chains. The verse on the gym wall was never about lifting more weight. It was written by a man who went hungry and learned not to panic. And the verse on the vision board was never about reaching your goals. It was spoken by a man who burned his list of accomplishments and called it freedom. The verse is not smaller than you thought. It is bigger. It just points in a direction the world will never put on a poster. Downward into humility, inward into dependence, and straight through suffering into a joy that does not need your circumstances to say yes. So which version have you been carrying? Tell me in the comments. And if no one has ever shown you the prison behind the promise, send this to the one person you know who is sitting in the room right now. They need the real verse, not the mug. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. This channel is a piece of my heart, and your support is what keeps the fire burning. If you found any value in this video, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's more than just a click to me. It's a sign that we're growing this community together. Having you on this journey is the greatest gift I could ask for. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.